London wore a damp grey shawl in the spring of 1876. The fog crept low along the Thames. Lamplight poured soft on wet stone. South of the river in Balham, Bedford Hill climbed quiet beneath a thin April mist. Tooting bygone lay beyond, dark and hushed. Near the crown of the hill stood a tall Gothic villa called the Priory. Its windows held a steady yellow glow. The hour was late. Inside, the candles had burned low. The hall clock struck once and fell silent. From a high bedroom came a sudden sound. A door flung wide, and then a young man's voice, ragged and thin, calling out for hot water. Skirts rustled in the corridor. A china jug rattled on its marble stand. The smell of Burgundy wine still drifted up from the dining room below. A barrister, only 30 years old, sagged against the doorframe, his face the colour of cold ash. He could not yet name the thing that had touched his lips. He did not know that 3 days of life remained to him. And outside, somewhere over the common, the April rain began to fall. Chapter 1. The London of Yellow Fog. Good evening and welcome. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small. This is the Bedside Historian, the place where the lamps are turned low and the centuries are read aloud to those who cannot sleep. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whether the hour outside your window is late or only beginning to lean toward late, the historian is glad of your company. Pause for a moment, if you will, and tell the dark where you are. A city, a quiet country road, a small room above a shop, and tell the dark what hour it shows on your clock. The historian does not need to hear it to know that you are there. If the voice that follows brings you any comfort tonight, the historian asks one small kindness in return. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Press the small mark of approval beneath the video. Each gentle tap helps the lamp burn longer and helps these stories drift out across the night to other listeners who lie awake in other rooms. Now settle in. Pull the blanket close. The world we are about to enter is not our own, but for an hour or two it will be. Let us drift backward. The year is 1876. The place is the great grey city of London, queen of an empire that stretches across half the painted globe. From the deck of a Channel steamer at dawn, she rises out of the river haze in long, low silhouettes. Spires. Chimneys. The dome of St. Paul's, like a pale grey moon. The Thames moves brown and slow beneath her bridges, thick with coal barges and oyster smacks. Tugboats whistle in the fog. Gulls drift lazy above the masts at Wapping. To stand in London in that spring is to stand inside a great breathing thing, a city of nearly 4 million souls. The largest gathering of human life the world has ever known. The colour of London then is yellow. Not the bright yellow of summer flowers, but the dim, sulphur yellow of coal smoke pressed flat against the rooftops. The fog of that century is not the soft white mist of poets. It is a living thing, born of 1,000,000 chimney pots burning sea coal day and night. It rolls down the streets thick as cream. It enters the lungs. It stains the curtains. It dulls the brass on every doorknob. By midday in some quarters the gas lamps must be lit again. Cabmen drive their horses by the sound of hooves on stone, for they cannot see the bridle. The poor cough into rags. The rich cough into linen. The fog does not choose. Beneath the fog lies a city of stone and iron and astonishing inequality. There is a London of carriages and silk gloves, of Mayfair drawing-rooms with marble fireplaces, of lemon ices in cut glass, of footmen in powdered hair. There is a London of liveried clubs along Pall Mall, where gentlemen take port after dinner and read the latest news of distant wars in the Times. And then, only a mile or two away, there is the other London, the London of Whitechapel and Bermondsey, the London of dripping cellars where whole families share a single straw mattress, the London of crossing sweepers no older than 9, who clear the horse manure from the road for a thrown halfpenny, the London of the workhouse bell, the gin palace, the cholera grave. Both Londons drink the same fog. Above all this stands the great unspoken law of the age: appearance, reputation, the unbroken surface of respectability. To be respectable in 1876 is to be safe. To lose respectability is to fall, and the fall is long. A young woman who slips, a young man who borrows too freely, a wife whose name is whispered at dinner, all may find the doors of polite houses closed against them by morning. Letters go unanswered. Invitations cease. The shop assistant turns her back. The carriage drives past. There is no court of appeal. The drawing-room has spoken. To keep that surface smooth, the Victorian household runs upon 1,000 small rituals. The morning calls between 3 and 5 in the afternoon, the cards left on a silver salver in the hall, the strict observance of mourning, with crape upon the bonnet for a husband, jet beads upon the throat, and the slow easing into half-mourning of grey and lavender after the proper years have passed. The dinner served at exactly 7:30, the ladies withdrawing to the drawing-room at 9, while the gentlemen remain at the table with their port, the candles snuffed, the prayers said, the day folded away like clean linen. Marriage in this world is not what marriage will become in later centuries. For a woman of property in 1876, the wedding ring is also, in a quiet legal sense, a key turned in a lock. Until the Married Women's Property Acts of later years take their full effect, much of what a wife brings into her marriage passes into her husband's hands. Her income, her shares, her house, in many cases. Her very person stands in old common law as something the husband may correct. To divorce is nearly impossible for a respectable woman. She must prove not only adultery but cruelty besides, and she must do so in open court before reporters who will print every word for the breakfast tables of England. Most do not try. Most stay. Most learn to fold their lives small and live inside the folds. Religion casts its long shadow over all of it. The Church of England fills its pews on Sunday mornings with frock coats and bombazine dresses. Sermons warn against pride and intemperance. Hymns rise into the rafters. Yet outside the church doors, a quieter faith governs daily life. The faith in propriety itself. To do as one's neighbours do. To be seen at the right pew. To avoid scandal as one would avoid the cholera. There is a great deal of God in Victorian England, but there is more, perhaps, of the dread of being talked about. Medicine, too, is a thing of strange and shifting borders in that year. The germ theory is new and not yet accepted by all. Bloodletting still has its defenders. Opium tinctures set in nearly every bedside drawer. Laudanum, that dark amber liquid of opium and alcohol, is given to crying babies and weary mothers alike. Sold over the counter at any chemist for a few pence. Chloroform was used for toothache and sleeplessness. Mercury still treats certain illnesses. Arsenic is sold openly for rats, for flies even, in tiny doses as a tonic for pale young women who wish for clearer skin. And antimony, that bitter metallic powder known to apothecaries as tartar emetic, is kept in stables across the kingdom. A few grains stirred into a horse's feed will cure it of worms. A few grains stirred into a glass of water will kill a man. The kingdom in that spring is ruled by Queen Victoria, 56 years old, still draped in the deep black of her widowhood, 15 years now since the loss of her beloved Albert. The Prime Minister is Mr. Disraeli, soon to crown the Queen as Empress of India. The empire stretches from the snows of Canada to the deserts of Egypt, from the Punjab to the goldfields of New South Wales. Telegraph wires sing beneath the oceans. Steam trains thunder across the moors. The first telephones are being whispered about in Boston and Edinburgh, though no London household yet owns one. Gas, not electricity, lights the streets. The hansom cab, two-wheeled and quick, is the carriage of choice. The omnibus, drawn by tired horses, rumbles down the Strand. It is from this London, this empire of yellow fog and starched linen, that our story comes. But the story does not unfold in the great houses of Belgravia, nor in the cold corridors of Westminster, nor among the gilded boxes of the Royal Opera. It unfolds in a leafy southern suburb, 4 miles from the dome of St. Paul's, where the city begins to thin into market gardens and common land. A place called Balham. In 1876, Balham is still half-country. The railway has come, yes. The trains of the London, Brighton and South Coast line stop at the small brick station near the high road. New villas of red brick and pale stucco are rising along Bedford Hill and along Nightingale Lane, built for clerks and barristers and prosperous tradesmen who wish to live above the smoke. Yet the cows still graze upon Tooting Becommon to the south, and the lanes are edged with hawthorn and elder. In the warmer evenings the sound of cricket bats can be heard from the green. There are public houses with low ceilings and oak benches. There is a circulating library. There is a small Anglican church whose bell carries clear over the rooftops. It is a quiet kind of place. The sort of place where nothing, the new arrivals like to say, ever happens. but Balham in that spring is also a place of long shadows. The common after dark is unlit. Gypsies still camp at its edges. Footpads, the highwaymen of the foot, are not unheard of along the lanes. The fog that settles upon central London settles also here, more thinly perhaps, but in the river valleys it pulls deep enough to swallow a horse. And on Bedford Hill, where the road climbs gently north toward Wandsworth, stands a particular house. Tall, Gothic in style. Its turrets pointed, its windows narrow, its great front door of dark oak set in a porch of pale stone, a house called the Priory. The Priory has stood there since the year 1812. It was built in the Regency taste for medieval things, all pinnacles and pointed arches, the work of a builder who fancied himself a man of romance. It was never a true monastery, though it bore the name. It was always simply a gentleman's villa set behind iron gates, in grounds of perhaps 3 acres of lawn, shrubbery, and old chestnut trees. By the 70s it has known several tenants, none of them remarkable. It is the kind of address a London estate agent describes in his neat copperplate hand as commodious, secluded, and well suited to a small but respectable family. In the autumn of 1874, a new tenant takes the lease. A young widow. Her name on the agreement is Florence Ricardo. She is 29 years old. She is wealthy, with a fortune of £40,000 inherited from a husband who died young and badly. She is beautiful. She is, as the polite phrase goes in that century, fast. She has a companion who comes with her, a quiet woman of about 40, dressed always in dark stuff, by the name of Mrs. Jane Cannon Cox. She brings with her also a household of servants, and a name that has already begun, in certain circles, to be whispered. The candles in the Priory's tall windows are lit each evening at dusk. The smoke of the kitchen rises in a pale plume. The hooves of the household horses sound on the gravel as the carriage is brought round. From the lane, the house looks well kept and prosperous. From the lane, in those last quiet months of the year, no one passing by would guess what is coming. For the world that has been described, the London of fog and respectability, the suburb of cricket and curates, the villa upon the hill, will, in the spring of 1876, draw together upon a single bedside. A young barrister will climb a staircase. A glass of water will stand upon a marble stand. A clock will strike, and the surface of Victorian respectability, so carefully kept, will crack from end to end. But that night is still some way ahead of us. First we must climb the gravel drive. We must look up at the turrets. We must enter the dark hall, smell the beeswax and the coal fire, hear the long case clock ticking in the corner. We must come to know the house itself. For the Priory, more than any person within it, is the silent witness of what is to come. The candles burn steady. The fog drifts low over Bedford Hill. Chapter 2. A house upon Bedford Hill. The road to Bedford Hill, in that spring of 1876, climbs gently from the rattle of Balham High Road. A traveller who steps down from the omnibus at the corner of Balham Hill will hear, almost at once, the world soften. The shouts of the costermongers fade. The clatter of iron-rimmed wheels on stone gives way to the softer crunch of wheels on gravel. The shop fronts, with their painted boards for tea and tobacco and patent boot blacking, fall away behind. The lane begins to bend. The houses grow larger, set back behind low brick walls and laurel hedges. Lilac trees lean over the railings. Somewhere a thrush sings in a sycamore. To climb Bedford Hill in the 1870s is to climb out of the city and into the last green ribbon of southern Surrey before the suburbs swallow it whole. To the west lies Wandsworth Common, broad and rough, dotted with thorn and gorse. To the south lies Tooting Common, 400 acres of grazing land where Romany families camp through the warmer months and where ponies still wander the loose. The air, even on a dull April day, smells faintly of grass cuttings and wet earth, of horse dung warming on stone, of coal smoke drifting down from 1,000 kitchen chimneys. Halfway up the hill on the eastern side of the road, the laurel hedges open into a pair of high iron gates. Above the gates, in worn black letters set against pale stone, is the single word that names the place. The Priory. The villa was built in the year 1812, in a brief and curious fashion the English call Regency Gothic. It is the work of an unknown builder who took the medieval imagination of Mr. Walpole and Mr. Beckford and shrank it to suburban scale. It is double-fronted, of cream-painted stucco over brick 2 stories high above a deep cellar. Its windows are tall and narrow, set in pointed arches, glazed with small lozenge panes. Above the second floor rise 4 slender turrets, one at each corner, capped with pinnacles of grey lead. Between them runs a parapet pierced with little quatrefoils, as if some country abbey had been folded down into the body of a gentleman's house. From the lane it looks like a child's drawing of a haunted thing. In the late spring sunlight, with its lawns trimmed and its window boxes filled, it looks merely fashionable. The drive curves up from the gates between rhododendron beds and old chestnut trees. The chestnuts in that April are just opening their pale candles of bloom. Beneath them, the gravel is raked each morning by an undergardener before the family comes downstairs. To the right of the drive, the carriage sweep widens before the front porch. The porch itself is a small gabled affair of pale stone, its inner walls panelled in dark oak. The door is of oak as well, studded with iron, and bears a heavy brass knocker shaped like a mastiff's head. Beside the door, at shoulder height, hangs a bell pull of brass and ivory, polished bright by the housemaid's morning round. Within the porch, the air is cool, even in summer. It smells of beeswax polish and the faint, sweet trace of pipe tobacco from the gentleman of the house. 2 chairs of carved oak stand against the panelling, where a tradesman or a footman might wait. A small mat of woven coir lies upon the flagstones. Above it hangs a single oil lantern, lit each evening at dusk by the parlour maid with a long brass taper. Beyond the front door lies the great hall of the Priory. It is a room 30 feet long and almost as wide, paved in black and white marble in the checkered pattern of an old country house. A staircase of polished mahogany rises against the right-hand wall, turning in 2 flights toward the bedrooms above. The banister is heavy and curved, its newel post topped with a carved acorn. Beneath the staircase, a tall, long case clock, made by a Mr. Voliami of Pall Mall in the late Georgian years, ticks with a slow and patient sound. Its brass face shows the moon's phases and a small painted ship that rocks softly with each second. The hall takes its light from a stained glass window above the half landing, in panels of red and blue and yellow, depicting roses and ivy in the arms of no one in particular. Off the hall, on the right, lies the morning room. It is furnished in the taste of a young woman of fortune. The walls are papered in pale green, with a small repeating pattern of fern fronds. The carpet is a deep aubusson, its colours softened by the long passage of feet. A grand piano of rosewood stands in one corner, its lid usually closed. On the piano lid sit framed photographs in silver, a woman in a dark riding habit, a slim young man in officer's uniform, an older gentleman with a long white beard. By the window stands a small writing desk of walnut, with a leather blotter, a silver inkwell shaped like a swan, and a stick of red sealing wax. It is at this desk that letters are written each morning, and lists for the cook drawn up and bills examined. Across the hall, on the left, lies the dining room. It is a darker room, panelled to shoulder height in oak, with a paper of crimson and gold above. The dining table is of mahogany and seats 12 when fully extended, though more often it is set for 3 or 4. The chairs are heavy, with carved backs and seats of horsehair upholstery. Above the marble fireplace hangs a large painting of a stag at bay in a Highland glen, the work of an unknown follower of Mr. Landseer. 2 silver candelabra of 7 branches, each stand upon the table. The sideboard along the inner wall holds a row of cut-glass decanters, claret, sherry, port, and the favourite of the master of the house, a deep red burgundy of the Côte de Nuits. Behind the decanters stands a tantalus, a wooden frame in which the bottles can be locked away from the servants when the family is from home. Beyond the dining room, at the back of the house, lies the library. Its walls are lined with bookshelves of dark wood, holding the standard furnishings of a respectable Victorian library. The bound sermons of South and Tillotson, the histories of Macaulay and Hume, the novels of Sir Walter Scott in red cloth, a complete Dickens in monthly parts bound up year by year, the family Shakespeare of Dr. Bowdler, a small leather-cased Bible. There is also, on a higher shelf, a row of red-bound legal volumes, the property of the gentleman of the house, who is by profession a barrister of the Inner Temple. The library has French doors that open onto the lawn, and on warm afternoons the smell of cut grass drifts in along with the bees. The kitchen lies below stairs, reached by a narrow service passage near the foot of the main staircase. Down a flight of stone steps one comes into a stone-flagged corridor, scrubbed pale by years of soap and water. To one side lies the cook's domain, Its great range of black iron, polished each morning with black lid, fills half a wall. Above it hang copper pans and ladles, polished bright by the scullery maid before breakfast. A long deal table runs down the middle of the room, scoured white. From the ceiling hang bunches of dried thyme and rosemary, and a string of onions. The cook in this household is a Mrs. Hunt, a woman of 50 or so, broad-armed and quiet-spoken, who has been in service since girlhood. She rises each morning at 5:30 and lights the range with paper, kindling, and small lumps of best Wallsend coal. Off the kitchen lies the scullery, with its single deep stone sink, its wooden draining board, and its great iron pump. The water of the Priory comes partly from the mains of the South London waterworks, and partly from a well in the kitchen yard. It is the scullery maid who fills the bedside jugs each evening, after supper, from a tall enamel pitcher kept on a marble slab. The jugs themselves are of white china, banded in blue, each with a matching basin. They are carried up the back stairs at dusk and set upon the marble washstand of each bedroom, beside a clean glass tumbler. That detail, the bedside jug, the tumbler, the carrying up of the water, will matter in the end. But not yet. Above stairs on the first floor lie the bedrooms. The principal bedchamber, occupied by the lady of the house, faces south over the garden. It is a long light room, papered in a small flowered pattern of pink and ivory. A great half-tester bed of mahogany stands against the inner wall, its hangings of pale rose silk. Beside the bed, a small table holds a Bible, a porcelain candlestick, and a tiny silver pillbox. Across the corridor, with a door connecting through a small dressing room, lies the bedroom of the master of the house. It is plainer. The paper is striped grey and cream. The bed is a four-poster of dark walnut. The wardrobe is full of frock coats and silk hats. The washstand is of marble. Upon it, when the household is settled for the night, stands the white china jug, full to the brim, and the clean glass tumbler at its side. Further along the corridor lies a small sitting room used through the day by the lady's companion, a Mrs. Cox, who reads there and writes letters to her 3 young sons at school in Streatham. Beyond it, the corridor turns and ascends a short flight to a smaller upper landing, where the servants' bedrooms lie under the eaves. The maids share 2 rooms there, with iron bedsteads and a single mirror between them. The cook has a room below, off the kitchen passage. The coachman, a man named Griffiths, lives in the stable block at the rear of the garden with his wife. The garden itself is the great pride of the place. It runs back from the house in a long sweep of lawn, broken by gravel paths and box hedges. There is a rose walk to the east, planted with old varieties already past their prime. There is a fish pond, fed by a small lead pipe from the well. There is a kitchen garden, enclosed by a brick wall of mellow red, where Mrs. Hunt grows her own herbs, and where the gardener trains pear trees against the warm bricks. At the bottom of the garden stands the stable yard. It is paved in cobble and smells of hay and harness oil. 2 carriage horses live there, a grey mare and a brown gelding, in clean stalls. Their tack hangs in a small saddle room on hooks of polished brass. Upon a high shelf in that saddle room sits, in an unlabelled brown bottle, a quantity of tartar emetic used by Griffiths from time to time to dose the horses against worms. He buys it in a small white paper packet from the chemist on the high road, for a few pence the ounce. He has done so for years. Almost every gentleman's stable in England keeps such a packet upon a shelf. This, then, is the Priory in the spring of 1876. A Gothic villa upon a quiet hill, a hall of black and white marble, a long case clock with a painted ship, a dining room of crimson and gold, where the burgundy stands in cut glass on the sideboard, a bedroom with a white china jug upon the marble washstand, a stable yard with a brown bottle on a high shelf, a garden of chestnut trees just coming into bloom, a house that wishes very much to be seen as respectable, and which, until a certain April night, will be. The candles will be lit, the clock will strike, and the people who walk these corridors will, in time, be drawn into the room where the white jug stands. But before they meet, before they marry, before they sit together at the long mahogany table, we must go further back. We must follow one of them, the lady of the house, across an ocean and across a marriage already lost, to the country estate where she was born. Florence Campbell, before she was Florence Ricardo, before she was Florence Bravo, must take her place in the story. Chapter 3. The Widow of Bescot Park. She was born in the warm dust of the Antipodes, on the 5th day of September in the year 1845. The place of her birth was a small house in Sydney, the harbour town that crouched at the edge of the great southern continent. The English had claimed only 57 years before. Her father was Robert Campbell, a Scottish-born merchant of Sydney, descended from the famous Campbells of Greenock, who had built much of the colony's early trade in tea and wool. Her mother was Anne, gentle and strict in equal measure, a woman who kept a small leather-bound prayer book always to hand. They named the new daughter Florence. The Sydney of her infancy was a place of bright light and red dust, of harbour gulls and the cries of dockmen, of hot wind off the sandstone bluffs and the sharp green smell of eucalyptus after rain. The Campbells lived in a modest house with deep verandas, where the family took tea in the cool of the evening as the sky turned the colour of crushed apricots. There were brothers and sisters around her. She was a healthy child, quick and laughing, with thick chestnut hair and very pale skin that the colonial sun could not quite touch. Yet Sydney, prosperous as it was not where Robert Campbell intended to remain. Like many Scots who had made their fortunes in the colonies, he wished, before the end of his days, to take his place among the landed gentry of England. In the year 1858, when Florence was a girl of 13, the family boarded a clipper ship at Circular Quay and sailed for the long voyage home. They rounded Cape Horn through a threshing winter sea. They put in at Rio de Janeiro, where Florence saw, from the deck, the green hills crowded with white houses and the dark figures of slaves at the dockside. They came at last up the channel to the wet grey of an English May. Robert Campbell's purchase, made by letter and lawyer through the long voyage, was Buscott Park, a great country estate in the soft chalk valleys of Berkshire, near the upper waters of the Thames. The house at Buscott was, and still is, a fine Georgian seat of pale stone, set in a park of great oaks and beeches, with a long curving drive, a lake of clear water, a chapel, a home farm, a model dairy, and tenant villages clustered respectfully at its skirts. Here Robert Campbell installed his family in the manner of an English squire. There were grooms in the stable yard, gardeners in the kitchen garden, footmen in the dining hall, a butler in black, a housekeeper in stiff bombazine. The Campbell children, all 7 of them, were drilled in the new life. There were French masters, drawing masters, music masters. The girls learned to ride side-saddle on quiet ponies along the bridle ways, to embroider, to sing simple songs at the piano in the drawing-room of an evening. Florence shone in this world, but only fitfully. She was clever, but not patient. She loved the horses more than the books. She rode hard, with a flush in her cheek and her hat askew. She read novels under the bedclothes by candlelight, the works of Ouida and Mrs. Radcliffe, and the early Wilkie Collins. She was passionate, with a temper that flashed quickly and faded as fast. She had, even as a girl of 16, a way of laughing that made the older ladies at the dinner table look down at their plates. She was, in the words of one of her mother's friends, written years afterward, far too much herself for the comfort of those around her. In the year 1864, when she was 19, a young officer of the Grenadier Guards came riding down the Buscott Drive to call upon her father. His name was Captain Alexander Lewis Ricardo. He was the grandson of the famous economist David Ricardo, born into a family of London Jewish bankers turned country gentry. He was tall, fair, very handsome. He had a beautiful tenor voice and a love of fast horses. He was 23 years old. Within months, he and Florence were engaged. The wedding took place at Buscott in September of that year. Florence wore white satin trimmed with point lace. The bells of the village church rang. The tenants drank her health on the morn. Her father gave her a settlement of £20,000 in railway stock, a small fortune. The marriage went wrong almost at once. Alexander Ricardo, behind his fair good looks, was a man already in the grip of a sickness that polite Victorian English called only the gentleman's failing. He drank. He drank in the regimental mess at dawn. He drank brandy in his dressing-room before parade. He drank port until 2 in the morning at his club in Pall Mall. By the time Florence had been his wife a year, she had seen him weep at the breakfast table, strike a manservant for spilling coffee, and fall down a staircase at a country house party in Leicestershire. He sold his commission in the Guards. He drifted through the spas of England and Germany, taking the cure, breaking the cure, taking it again. Florence followed him. She nursed him. She begged him. She prayed at the bedsides of 6 hotel rooms in Cheltenham, in Wiesbaden, in Brighton. It was in this drift, in the year 1870, that her mother sent her to a place in the western counties of England that had become the great hope of those who wished to be saved from drink and despair. The place was called Malvern, and the name spoken among its visitors was that of Dr. James Manby Gully. Of Dr. Gully we shall speak in his own chapter. For now, let it stand that Florence and her sick young husband took rooms at Malvern in the spring of '70, and that there, beneath the long blue ridge of the Malvern Hills, certain things began that would lead, 6 years later, to a bedside on Bedford Hill. Alexander Ricardo did not stay long under the water cure. He left for Cologne in the early months of 1871, alone. He took rooms in a hotel beside the Rhine. He locked his door against the chambermaid. He drank himself, in a long shaking week, to death. The German doctor who certified the body wrote the cause as habitual intemperance leading to the failure of the heart. He was 28 years old. Florence, 25, became a widow. She came home to England in mourning weeds. Her father had died 2 years before, leaving Biscot Park to her elder brother. By her marriage settlement and by her late husband's will combined, Florence Ricardo, widow, was now mistress of nearly £40,000 in her own right. In the money of that time, this was a great fortune. The interest alone could keep a household of 6 servants in comfort for the rest of her natural life. She was young. She was beautiful. She was free. For a young widow of fortune in 1871, freedom was a more complicated thing than it sounded. Florence took rooms first in Malvern, then in a small house in the seaside town of Brighton, then in a leased villa in the leafy southern London suburb of Streatham. She rode in the morning. She received friends in the afternoon. She kept a modest carriage. She was, in the fashion of that brief and terrible window, a woman with money and no husband to govern it. She could sign her own cheques. She could choose her own table linen. She could refuse, with a simple word to the parlour-maid, anyone she did not wish to receive. What she could not do was love openly. Dr. Gully, the kindly water-cure physician of Malvern, was 37 years older than she was, and married. His wife, an invalid long since, lived in a house in the country, attended by paid nurses and rarely seen. He could not divorce her. To divorce her would have been to crucify himself in the press. And yet through the years 71, 72 and 73, Florence Ricardo and James Gully spent long quiet days together. They walked the hills above Malvern. They took rooms in country inns under false names. They travelled very discreetly on the continent. It is in this period that the second great wound of Florence's young life was inflicted. In the spring of 1873, in a small set of lodgings in Kissingen, a German spa town in Bavaria, Florence Ricardo found herself with child. She was 28. The father was Dr. Gully. There was no possibility of marriage. There was no possibility of acknowledging the child. There was, in that century, only one thing that women of her position were quietly told to do. A medical procedure was performed. It was, by the standards of the day, dangerous and illegal. Florence very nearly died. She lay for weeks in a darkened German bedroom, fed beef tea by a hired nurse, listening to the church bells of a foreign town. She came home thinner and quieter. The affair with Dr. Gully went on, but the joy had gone out of it. By the autumn of 1874, with her family threatening to cut off all communication unless she ended the connection, Florence broke from him. The break was final, formal, almost surgical. She wrote a letter. She returned certain gifts. She agreed never to be alone with him again. He, broken, retired from his practice and went to live near the Crystal Palace in suburban London with his sister. To rebuild her life, Florence needed 2 things. She needed a house of her own, a respectable address, far enough from her old haunts to seem like a fresh page, and she needed a respectable woman to live in that house with her, a companion of unimpeachable character, whose presence would silence the whisperers. Within months, she had found both. The house, taken on a long lease at £6 the week, was the Priory, Bedford Hill, Balham. The companion was a small, dark-eyed widow of about her own age, the mother of 3 young boys, whom Florence had met during a season at Malvern. Her name was Mrs. Jane Cannon Cox. She had been born in the West Indies, of a Jamaican planter family. Her late husband had died in the East. Her 3 sons were boarded at a school in Streatham. She came to the Priory in the autumn of 1874 with 2 black trunks and a work basket. She slept in a small room along the upper corridor. She was paid £100 the year. She was, at her own request, called Mrs. Cox by everyone in the household, masters and servants alike. She kept the household accounts. She wrote the menus. She read aloud in the evenings. She was, to all the world, the perfect duenna. Yet behind her quiet eyes, Mrs. Cox carried her own anxieties. Her 3 boys cost money. Her position at the Priory depended entirely upon the goodwill of a young, beautiful, and somewhat lonely employer. Should that young employer marry, and should the new master of the house decide that a paid companion was no longer needed, Mrs. Cox and her 3 boys would find themselves quietly, politely ruined. Through the winter of 74 and into the year 75, the 2 women lived together at the Priory in a kind of careful stillness. Florence rode in the morning along the lanes towards Streatham. Mrs. Cox wrote her letters at the little walnut desk by the window. The chestnut trees in the drive came into leaf and went. The dinner gong rang each evening at 7:30. The candles were lit. The fire was banked. The white china jug was filled and set upon the marble washstand. Nothing at all happened. Then, in the autumn of 1875, into this quiet house walked a young barrister of 30, very ambitious, very careful with money, very newly introduced to Florence Ricardo by mutual friends. His name was Charles Deloney Turner Bravo. Chapter 4. The Water Cure Doctor. To understand the long shadow that fell across the Priory in the spring of 1876, we must travel west out of London, into the soft green country of the Severn Valley, to the small market town of Great Malvern in Worcestershire. We must go back, perhaps, 25 years before the death of Charles Bravo, to the years when an ageing Scotsman, with a kind eye and a thick silver beard, built upon the slopes of those hills one of the most famous medical establishments in the kingdom. Malvern in the 1850s and 60s was unlike any other resort in England. Its hills, the Malverns, rise 900 feet from the floor of the surrounding plain in a long, blue ridge of ancient stone. Springs of cold, pure water gush from their flanks. The air, swept clean by westerly winds from the Welsh mountains, was held, by physicians of the day, to be the healthiest in England. To drive up from the railway station along the steep streets of the town, in those years, was to pass row after row of pale stuccoed houses lettered in gilt, each declaring itself a hydropathic establishment under the care of some doctor or other. The pavements thronged with thin, pale men in greatcoats, with wrapped-up ladies leaning on companions, with bath chairs pushed by liveried attendants, with bearded clergymen newly arrived from city pulpits to be cured of their nerves. The man who had begun all of this, the man whose name was spoken with something close to reverence in those streets, was Dr. James Manby Gully. He had been born in Jamaica in the year 1808, the son of a coffee planter, and brought home to England as a boy. He had studied medicine at Edinburgh and Paris, and had begun practice in London in the conventional way as a physician of Mayfair, prescribing the bleedings and blisterings and mercury pills that were the pride of British medicine in the 1830s. Yet he had grown weary of all that. He had read of the new water cure being practiced by a peasant healer named Vincent Prisnitz in the mountains of Silesia. He had travelled to see it. And in the year 1842, with a colleague named James Wilson, he had set up at Great Malvern an English version of the same cure, the first of its kind in the kingdom. The treatment that he offered his patients was, by the standards of conventional medicine, very simple, almost monastic. They rose at dawn. They were wrapped in cold wet sheets and rolled in blankets. They sweated. They were unwrapped, plunged into cold sitz-beds, slapped briskly dry by attendants. They walked for 2 or 3 hours along the steep lanes of the hills, drinking glasses of pure spring water at every turn. They ate plain food, brown bread, a little meat, fruit, no wine, no spirits, no rich sauces. They went to bed at 10. The cure took weeks, sometimes months. It was, in essence, a long and disciplined cleansing of the body, and to a generation of well-fed Victorians ruined by port, by laudanum, by greasy mutton, by want of exercise, it produced, in case after case, what looked very like a miracle. By the time Florence Ricardo and her dying young husband climbed the Malvern Hills in the spring of 1870, Dr. Gully was 62 years old. He was tall, slightly stooped, with a long white beard that fell below his collar. His eyes were a clear, kindly blue. He spoke quietly. He listened more than he spoke. He had cured, or so it was said, half the writers and thinkers of the age. Mr. Charles Dickens had taken his cure. Mr. Tennyson had taken it. Mr. Carlyle, Miss Florence Nightingale, Mr. Charles Darwin had spent long months in a small white house called the Lodge under Dr. Gully's care, and had written home that he had begun, at last, to feel almost human again. To be received by Dr. Gully at his consulting rooms in Wells House was, for a respectable patient, very nearly a sacrament. For Florence, 25 years old that spring, exhausted by 3 years of nursing a husband who could not be saved, the kindness of Dr. Gully was something she had not known she was thirsting for. He listened. He did not flinch when she described in low, halting words the things she had endured. He did not hurry her. He prescribed for her not only the cure of cold water, but the cure of long walks upon the hills, of plain food, of early hours, of the reading aloud of poetry in the evening. Within weeks, she was sleeping again. Within months, her cheeks had colour. Her husband, returning to her from a continental journey, looked at her across the dining table and could not understand the change. What had begun in those early weeks as the regard of a kindly physician for an unhappy patient deepened through the spring of 70 and into the summer into something else. Letters were written, which both later regretted, in which the doctor of 62 and the patient of 25 spoke of one another in language that no consulting room ever heard. A Victorian friendship had become a Victorian indiscretion. After the death of Alexander Ricardo at Cologne in the early days of 71, the indiscretion deepened into an attachment that was quietly, carefully, and very thoroughly known to a small circle in Malvern. Dr. Gully was, of course, married. He had been married for 40 years to a wife whose mind had gone many years before, who lived in a separate establishment, attended by nurses, and who saw nobody. Divorce, in 1871 England, was a thing reserved for adulterous wives, drunken husbands, and the rich enough to buy private bills of Parliament. Even had Mrs. Gully been willing, the case would have been impossible. The doctor, whatever he felt for the young widow at his side on the long walks above Malvern, could give her nothing in the eyes of the law. What followed lasted 3 years. There were holidays at country inns in the Welsh borders, taken under the name of Mr. and Mrs. Walker. There was a long visit to the continent in the autumn of 72, through France, and into the warm valleys of southern Germany. There was a quiet villa in the Surrey Hills, taken in the doctor's name, where the young widow stayed for weeks at a time. There were jewels, given softly, never showy. There was throughout the careful protection of the small circle around them, paid companions who looked the other way, hotel keepers who took their gold and asked no questions, the loyalty of trusted servants. It is here that Mrs. Jane Cox, the small dark-eyed widow who would later sit at the desk in the morning room of the Priory, first enters our story. She had been engaged at Malvern as a paid friend to Florence, a respectable widow herself, who could travel with the young Mrs. Ricardo and sit beside her at table d'hote and lend, by her presence, a thin veil of propriety to journeys that needed every veil they could find. Mrs. Cox had 3 young sons in school. Mrs. Cox could not afford to disapprove. Mrs. Cox saw a great deal, said almost nothing, and, in the steady way of women who have learnt to survive, made herself indispensable. The wound came in the spring of 73. It came, as such wounds came in that century, in a small set of upstairs rooms in a German spa town, behind a closed door, with a hired German doctor and a basin of hot water. Florence had become with child by Dr. Gully. There could be no public birth. There could be no acknowledgement. There could be only what was done. It was done. Florence almost died of the doing. She lay for weeks afterward in a darkened room, fed by Mrs. Cox with beef tea and weak wine. The doctor of 65 sat beside her bed, holding her hand, weeping quietly into his beard. After that, the romance, by its very nature, could not be the same. Florence recovered her body, but a great cold place had opened within her. Her family, the Campbells of Buscott Park, had begun by this time to receive whispers of what was happening, and the whispers had grown into a roar. Her brother, now master of Buscott, wrote stiff letters threatening to cut her off entirely from the family if she did not break with Dr. Gully. Her mother, on her own side, wrote pleading letters in shaking copperplate. By the autumn of 74, after long months of half-partings and tearful reconciliations, Florence ended it. The ending was done in the manner of her century. There was a final letter. There was a return of certain gifts in a small wooden box. There was a formal undertaking witnessed by Mrs. Cox that the two would not meet alone again. Dr. Gully, a man of nearly 70, retired from his practice at Malvern. He took a small house in the suburb of Sidon, near the great glass and iron palace where Mr. Paxton's exhibition had been re-erected. He lived there with his unmarried sister. He kept a few patients, friends from old days, but he no longer climbed the hills at dawn. He grew quieter. His beard turned a greyer white. For Florence, the end of the affair left her with one great burden that the new century would have called shame, and which her own century called scandal. The whispers at country house parties did not stop. The looks at Ascot did not soften. Old friends crossed the street in Mayfair. To restore herself in the eyes of the world, she needed something more than a quiet house and a paid companion. She needed a husband. A respectable one. A young one. One whose name, set against hers in the parish register, could begin to wash the older name away. It was in this need, in the late summer of 1875, that a London barrister of 30 was brought to call upon her at the Priory, by way of an introduction made through Mrs. Cox's circle of friends. He was prompt. He was tidy. He was ambitious. He was unattached. His name, at that first calling, was Charles Bravo. What he carried with him into the morning room of the Priory, what manners he had, what grievances, what watchfulness about money, what private cruelties, we shall see in the chapter that follows. For now it is enough to know that he came up the gravel drive between the chestnut trees on a quiet afternoon, that the parlour-maid took his card on a silver salver, that Florence rose from the walnut desk by the window, that Mrs. Cox, sitting in her customary chair beside the fire, looked up over her embroidery and watched. The candles burned steady. The clock in the hall ticked through its slow and patient seconds. And outside, far away, in a small Sydenham house beside the Crystal Palace, an old man in a study sat alone, with the smell of cold water and crushed bay leaves drifting in from his sister's garden, and bent his white head over a book he was not reading. Chapter 5. A Marriage in Winter. The autumn of 1875 came down soft and yellow over the southern suburbs of London. The plane trees along the Thames embankment turned to copper. The chestnuts in the drive at Bedford Hill dropped their first brown fruits onto the gravel, where the under-gardener swept them up each morning into a wicker basket. The mornings carried a thin white mist off Tooting Beck Common. The evenings brought the smell of bonfires, of garden leaves burning at the bottoms of long lawns, of coal fires, newly lit in drawing-rooms, of the first hot soups served in the dining halls of England. It was into this gentle, smoky season that the young barrister made his first call at the Priory. He came up the drive on foot, having taken the train down from Victoria, and walked the half-mile from Balham station. His name, written in a clean clerk's hand upon the calling card he gave the parlour-maid, was Mr. Charles Deloney Turner Bravo. He was 30 years old, of medium height, with a thick brown moustache, dark eyes set rather close together, a high forehead, and a certain neat trimness about his person that spoke of a man who watched his linen and counted his shillings. He wore a black frock coat of good cloth, a high collar, a dark silk cravat fastened with a small gold pin, narrow trousers and boots that had been polished that morning by a servant of his own. He carried a tall silk hat in one gloved hand and a malacca cane in the other. His history, as far as the world of his time was permitted to know it, was respectable. He had been born in St. Pancras, London, on the 30th of November in the year 1845, the son of Augustus Charles Turner. His father had died when he was small. His mother had married, in his boyhood, a prosperous merchant of Portuguese Jewish descent named Joseph Bravo, who had spent many years in the West Indies and had returned to England with a large fortune in indigo and timber. The boy had taken his stepfather's surname. He had been sent to King's College School in London. He had read for the bar at the Middle Temple. He had been called to the bar in the year 1870. He was, by the autumn of 75, building a small but steady practice from chambers near the Inner Temple, with his stepfather's assistants behind him and a comfortable allowance from his stepfather's purse. He was also, behind that respectable surface, a man of certain private secrets. He had, some years before, fathered a daughter upon a young woman named Nicholson, with whom he had lived for a time in Maidenhead. The child, a girl named Katie, was being quietly raised at his expense in a small establishment outside London. He had, by his own admission to friends, an eye for what was called in those drawing-rooms an advantageous marriage. He had a careful nature with money. He kept a ledger in his desk in which he entered every shilling spent. He was quick of temper when crossed, slow to forgive a slight, and capable of a particular kind of cold sarcasm that made the servants of his bachelor lodgings in Bedford Square dread the sound of his bell. The introduction had been made through a circle of friends in common. a network of barristers' wives and clergymen's daughters, of the kind that wove the marriage market of suburban London together, a certain mutual acquaintance, knowing that the young Mrs. Ricardo was now disengaged from her unhappy attachment, and knowing also that the young Mr. Bravo was looking about him for a wife of fortune, had arranged that the two should meet at a country house in Brighton in the late summer. They had met. They had walked along the King's Road. They had taken tea in a hotel on the seafront. The young barrister had come up to London afterwards and made discreet inquiries at his club about Mrs. Ricardo's exact position. The young widow had returned to Balham, sat down at the walnut desk by the window, and written a letter to Mrs. Cox, who was visiting her sons at school, asking her to come home at once. By the early autumn, the calling at the Priory had begun in earnest. Charles came down on Saturday afternoons. He took tea in the morning room with Florence and Mrs. Cox. He admired the rose walk. He played the piano a little in a stiff, correct way. He drove out with Florence in her small phaeton along the lanes toward Wimbledon. He was, in those early weeks, on his very best behaviour. He spoke softly. He laughed at her stories. He bent over the hand of Mrs. Cox in farewell with a courtesy almost too elaborate. And yet, even in those courting weeks, the small fissures of what was to come had already begun to show. The matter of the Sydenham doctor came up almost at once. Charles, when the engagement was first being discussed in early November, declared with a careful formality that he must be told everything. Florence, in a long evening interview in the morning room, with Mrs. Cox seated quietly by the fire as witness, told him the bare outline of her past. She named the doctor. She names the years. She did not name the Spey town and Bavaria, nor what had been done there, but she gave him to understand, in the language of the day, that the connection had been more than a friendship. Charles listened with his head bowed. He paled, but he did not rise. At the end of it, he took her hand and said that what was past, and that he would never speak of it again so long as she would now be entirely his. He did not keep that promise. Through the weeks that followed, in small private moments, he returned to it. A reference dropped at dinner. A question, lightly put, about a particular date. A coldness when she received a letter from Malvern, even from another correspondent. He never raised his voice in these moments. He did not need to. The slow drip of his sarcasm was enough. The matter of the money came up next. Florence, by the terms of her late father's will and her late husband's settlement combined, was now possessed of nearly £40,000, held entirely in her own name. Charles, as her future husband, would by the common law of England take a great deal of that money into his hands at the moment of marriage. The Married Women's Property Act of '73 had already begun, in a small way, to reform this older law. But the changes were partial, and a determined husband could still take much. Charles had no intention of being less than determined. He insisted, in long careful conversations with her solicitors, that the marriage settlement should leave him in control of the bulk of her income for her lifetime. He insisted that the lease of the Priory, taken originally in her name, should be transferred to him at the wedding. He insisted that the household servants should answer to him. He insisted, with a certain pinched expression about the mouth, that her annual expenditure must in future be held within a budget set by him. Florence agreed to most of it, with a tiredness that those around her noticed. Mrs. Cox, sitting at the side of these meetings, watched and said nothing. The matter of Mrs. Cox herself was the third thread of friction. Charles had no objection to the small dark widow personally. He found her quiet, useful, and apparently devoted to his bride. But the cost of her keeping, £100 the year, plus her board, plus the school fees of her 3 boys at Streatham, paid in part out of Florence's purse, struck him at once as a heavy charge upon a household already, in his view, more extravagant than it should be. He let it be known, in low remarks at table, that in his opinion Mrs. Cox might in time be encouraged to find a smaller establishment of her own. Mrs. Cox, hearing of these remarks through the loyal report of the housemaid, set her small pale lips and went on writing the menus. The wedding was set for the 7th of December 1875. It was to be a very quiet affair, in keeping with the wishes of both families, neither of whom particularly relished the union. Florence's brother at Buscott Park had not come round to it. Charles's stepfather and mother, while willing to accept the heiress, had been alarmed when they discovered the existence of the Sydenham doctor in her past, and had pressed Charles to break it off. Charles had refused. The fortune, in his calculation, more than balanced the stain. The ceremony took place at All Saints, Mortlake, a small parish church on the Surrey side of the river. The morning was raw and grey, with a thin sleet falling. Florence wore a gown of pale dove silk, no veil, and a small bonnet trimmed with white camellias. Charles wore his frock coat and a white waistcoat. There were perhaps a dozen people in the pews. The vicar read the service quickly. The register was signed in a vestry that smelled of damp hymn books. The wedding breakfast was taken at a hotel near Richmond, with cold game pie and champagne and very little laughter. By 2 o'clock, the new Mr. and Mrs. Bravo were in a carriage to the station, on their way to a wedding journey in Brighton. Brighton in December was a town of bare elms and grey sea and empty bath chairs along the front. They took a suite at a hotel on the King's Road. They were there for 12 days. What passed in those rooms is not, by the kindness of history, written down in any document we may now read. We know only this. They returned to the Priory shortly before Christmas. Florence, who had been a healthy young woman in the autumn, had begun to suffer from an illness none of her doctors could quite name. She vomited. She had pains in her stomach. She lost weight quickly. She lay on the sofa in the morning room with a shawl over her knees and did not ride. The first physician called in from Streatham examined her and declared it the natural unsettling of a young marriage. The second physician, called in by Mrs. Cox in early January, suggested that the new Mrs. Bravo was perhaps too excitable in her temperament and prescribed a tonic of iron. The third physician, called in privately and confidentially by Florence herself in February, listened more carefully and asked her, with a gentleness she had not been treated with for some time, whether her husband was in any way unkind to her. Florence put her face in her hands and wept. What had begun in those first months of marriage had a particular pattern. The quarrels came at night. The cause was sometimes the doctor at Sydenham. The cause was sometimes the bills from the dressmaker. The cause was sometimes a remark about Mrs. Cox. The cause was sometimes a silence at dinner. They began with a sharp word from Charles, escalated through her tears, and ended with a slammed door and a long sleepless watching of the ceiling in the dark. Twice in those months Florence appeared at breakfast with a bruise upon her arm. Once, in a fit of rage, Charles had threatened in front of Mrs. Cox to cut his own throat. Once he had thrown her copy of a French novel into the dining-room fire. Once he had said, very quietly, with his eyes upon his plate, that if she ever spoke the doctor's name again, he would make her sorry for it. In late January, Florence found herself with child. The news was received at first with relief. A child might soften him. A child might give the marriage a centre of stillness. She wrote with quiet joy to her mother. She began to plan a nursery in the small south-facing room next to her own bedchamber. She sat in the morning room with a piece of small white embroidery in her lap, and Mrs. Cox beside her hemmed flannel for an infant's sheet. The child did not live to be born. In early March the pregnancy ended. Florence, weakened by the months of vomiting and quarrels, lay for 3 weeks in her bedroom with the curtains drawn, fed by Mrs. Cox with arrowroot and weak wine. Her mother came down from the country and stayed at her bedside. Charles in those weeks was distant and irritable. He took dinner alone in the dining room. He read his briefs by the fire. He went up to town early and came home late. By the end of March, Florence had risen from her bed, but was still pale, still thin. The weather had turned milder. The chestnuts at the head of the drive were pushing out their first soft green. Mrs. Cox suggested that a holiday by the sea might restore the new Mrs. Bravo. Worthing, perhaps, or Bournemouth. The doctor agreed. Florence wrote to engage rooms at Worthing for the early days of April. Charles refused. The expense, he said, was excessive. The household had been overspending for months. They could not afford it. There was an argument in the morning room on a Tuesday afternoon, with the spring sun falling in long golden bars across the carpet, in which Charles raised his voice for the first time in front of Mrs. Cox, and Florence raised hers in return. He struck her. She cried out. He left the room. The matter of Worthing was not raised again. By the second week of April, the household at the Priory had settled into a kind of brittle quiet. The doctor at Sydenham was never spoken of. The white china jug was filled each evening as before. The burgundy was decanted in the dining room. The candles were lit in their candelabra. The clock in the hall ticked through its slow and patient seconds. Florence was thinner than she had been in the autumn. Charles was sharper, smaller, more watchful. Mrs. Cox was, as ever, silent. On the 18th of April, 1876, Charles Bravo, having argued with his wife in the carriage on their way into town that morning, and having been thrown later from a small pony in the lanes near Tooting, came home to the Priory at 6 in the evening, took a long hot bath, dressed for dinner, and came down to the dining room. The table was set for 3. The candles were lit. The burgundy stood on the sideboard in its cut-glass decanter. The clock in the hall struck the half-hour. Through the open window of the morning room, the smell of damp lilac drifted in from the garden. It was the last evening of his life. Chapter 6. The quiet rooms of the Priory before the candles burn down upon that table, before the soup is taken away and the fish is brought in and the lamb carved upon its silver dish. Let the listener stand a little apart and watch the house itself at the close of an ordinary Victorian day. A house in 1876 was a clock of human movement, wound by quiet hands long before its masters rose. The day at the Priory began at 5 in the morning, when the bell of the parish church on Balham High Road struck once, soft and far. The first to rise was the housemaid, Mary Ann Keeber, a young woman of 22 from a market town in Sussex. She slept under the eaves in a small whitewashed room that she shared with the under-housemaid, beneath a sloping ceiling, on an iron bedstead with a flock mattress, a clean linen sheet, and a brown blanket. Her face was washed in cold water from a tin basin. She dressed in the dark, by feel, in a print gown of dark blue with small white flowers, a starched apron, and a white cap pinned over her hair. She put on stout black boots that creaked with each step. By 5:15 she was downstairs, in the great kitchen below the hall, kneeling on a strip of sacking before the iron range. The range had gone out in the night. She raked out the cold ash with a small flat shovel and tipped it into a tin pail. She laid sticks of kindling, a twist of yesterday's newspaper, a handful of small Welsh coal. She struck a lucifer match from a tin box, watched the flame catch, and slowly fed the fire until it roared softly behind the iron door. From a copper kettle on the hob, she filled a smaller copper for the upstairs hot water cans. While the kettle came to the boil, she scrubbed the front doorstep with hearthstone and a brick of yellow soap, kneeling on a folded cloth, her hands red in the cold spring air. She blacked the morning room grate with a stick of blacklid and a brush, polishing the iron until it gleamed. She dusted the marble of the hall with a soft cloth. She wound, by means of a small brass key kept in a velvet-lined box on the mantel, the great long-case clock, 3 slow turns of the key, until the weights climbed inside their dark case. By 6 the cook had risen. Mrs. Hunt, a widow of 50 from the county of Devon, slept in a small panelled room beside the kitchen. She came into her domain in a print gown, a dark calico apron over it, her grey hair pinned up beneath a white linen cap. She put a great copper pan upon the range and set water on for the household tea. She drew flour from a dry oak bin, broke eggs into a brown pottery bowl, lit a smaller side fire in the bread oven. She did not waste a movement. She had cooked breakfast in country houses and seaside lodgings and London terraces since she was 13 years old. She did not need to think about what she was doing, only to do it. By 6:30 the under-housemaid was at her own labours. She filled white china hot water cans, 2 pints each, and carried them up the back stairs, one in each hand, to the bedrooms of the house. She tapped softly at each door, set the can upon the marble washstand, withdrew. She emptied the chamber pots into a slop pail. She drew back the heavy curtains in the morning room and the dining room and the library. She laid fresh fires in the morning room grate and the library grate, ready to be lit when the family came down. By 7 the coachman, George Griffiths, was in the stable-yard. He was a man of about 30, square-shouldered, sharp-faced, with sandy whiskers and very pale eyes. He had once been Dr. Gully's coachman at Malvern. When the doctor retired, Florence had taken him on, partly out of charity and partly out of habit. He lived above the stable block with his wife. He rose at 6. He fed and watered the 2 carriage horses, the grey mare Cremon and the brown gelding Victor, in their loose boxes. He mucked out their straw with a long-handled fork. He polished their tack in the small saddle-room. He brushed their coats with a dandy brush until they shone like wet leather. In that same saddle-room, on a high shelf above his workbench, beside a tin of saddle soap and a half-empty bottle of horse liniment, sat the small brown bottle of tartar emetic that he used twice a year to dose the horses against worms. The bottle was labelled in his own thick pencil hand. There was, in 1876, no law in England requiring that such a poison be kept under lock and key, and Griffiths, like most coachmen of his generation, did not keep it so. He took it down when he needed it, 2 or 3 times a year. He measured a careful dose. He returned the bottle to the shelf. He thought no more about it. By 7:30, the masters and mistresses began to stir. Florence usually rang her bell first. Her bedroom on the south side of the first floor faced the lawn, and in the early spring sunlight her room was the brightest in the house. The under-housemaid carried in a small tray of plain china upon which stood a cup of tea and a thin slice of bread and butter. She drew Florence's bath in the small bathroom across the corridor, fed by the new South London water mains and warmed from a copper boiler in the kitchen. She laid out Florence's morning gown of grey flannel upon the bed. She withdrew, closing the door softly. Mrs. Cox, in her smaller room along the corridor, rose without bells. She made her own bed each morning, a habit acquired in the long years of her widowhood, when there had been no money for servants. She knelt on a small piece of carpet beside her bed and said her morning prayers in silence. She then dressed in her customary black or dark stuff gown, a plain white collar, a small jet brooch at her throat, her dark hair smoothed beneath a small lace cap. She came down to breakfast with her work basket on her arm. Charles Bravo rose later than the women. He liked to lie in his four-poster until 8, with a tin can of hot water set ready outside his door. He shaved himself before the looking-glass in his dressing room, with a pearl-handled razor and a brush of badger hair. Lathering his face with a hard cake of soap, perfumed faintly with bergamot, he dressed in shirts of fine linen sent up from a shop in Jermyn Street, in a frock coat brushed for him each morning by the under-housemaid in the brushing closet at the head of the stairs. He came down to breakfast with the air of a man going to court, which, on most mornings, he was. Breakfast was taken at 8:30 in the dining-room. The table was laid with a white damask cloth. Upon the sideboard stood silver-covered dishes kept warm over small spirit lamps containing kidneys in a brown sauce, sliced cold ham, kedgeree of rice and smoked haddock, scrambled eggs, hot toast in a rack, butter in a small glass dish, a pot of black tea, a pot of coffee. Charles helped himself first. Florence took only a little toast and weak tea. Mrs. Cox took kedgeree and a little ham. They spoke of small things. The newspaper, the Times, and its tall folded sheets lay folded by Charles's plate. By 9:30, the carriage was at the door. The grey mare Cremorne was harnessed to a small dark green brougham. Charles climbed in. Florence sometimes drove with him as far as Victoria, sometimes not. The carriage rolled down the gravel drive and out through the iron gates and up the lane, and the house behind it settled into the longer rhythm of the day. The middle hours of the morning belonged to the women. Florence sat at the walnut desk in the morning room and wrote her letters in a neat sloping hand on cream paper headed simply, the Priory, Balham, SEWT. She wrote to her mother. She wrote to her sister. She wrote sometimes to her old governess in Berkshire. She did not write any longer to Sydenham. Mrs. Cox sat in her customary chair beside the fire with her embroidery, a piece of fine linen upon which she was working, a border of small ivy leaves in pale silk. She did not raise her eyes often from her work. When she did, she looked through the window at the chestnut trees coming into leaf. The cook in her kitchen wrote her order for the day's dinner upon a slate. The butcher's boy came at 11, with a basket on his arm, bringing whatever joint had been ordered the day before. The fishmonger came at noon with his cart, the iced fish glistening on its bed of green parsley. A grocer's apprentice came twice a week with sugar in blue paper twists, and tea in tin canisters, and a small brown package of currants. The cost of every item was entered by Mrs. Hunt in a small leather-bound book, and rendered each Friday afternoon to Mrs. Cox at the morning-room desk, who initiated the totals in pencil and passed the book back. In the early afternoon, weather permitting, Florence walked. She put on a darker walking dress of grey serge, a small black hat, and stout button boots. She took her parasol. Mrs. Cox came with her, dressed in her usual black, a step behind. They walked down the drive, out at the gates, and along the lane that led to Tooting Beck Common. The common in April was bright with celandines and the first lemon-coloured cowslips at the edges of the paths. Children played at marbles by the side of the path. A farmer's boy drove 3 cows along to be milked. The 2 women walked half a mile, perhaps a little more, and turned. They came home in time for tea at 4. Tea in the morning-room was the small bright sacrament of the afternoon. The under-housemaid carried in a silver tray laid with a white cloth, a teapot of plain silver, a small cream jug, a sugar bowl with silver tongs, a plate of thin bread and butter, a plate of small currant cakes, a glass dish of strawberry preserve. The tea was made strong, in the way of those years. Florence and Mrs. Cox sat at the small table by the window. Sometimes Florence read aloud in a low, clear voice from a novel of the day. Mrs. Cox stitched at her ivy leaves and listened. The clock ticked. The chestnut swayed. By 5, Charles came home. The carriage rolled up the drive. He climbed down. He went into the library and rang for hot water. He read his correspondence by the fire. He came up to dress for dinner at 7. He chose his tie with the same care that he chose his briefs. He came down to the dining room at 7:30 precisely. Dinner at the Priory in those last weeks was a thing of small ceremonies and quiet tensions. There was soup served from a tureen by the parlour-maid. There was a fish course, usually whiting or sole, dressed lightly in butter. There was a roast, lamb or fowl or beef carved by Charles at the head of the table. There were vegetables in covered silver dishes, potatoes and carrots and spring greens. There was a savoury at the end, a small dish of anchovies on toast or poached eggs upon a bed of spinach. There were the wines. Sherry for the soup, hock for the fish, claret, or, more often in recent weeks, Burgundy for the roast. The Burgundy stood on the sideboard in a tall cut-glass decanter. Charles loved it. He drank, by his own admission, perhaps half a bottle each night. After dinner the women withdrew to the morning room. Charles remained alone in the dining room, sometimes for as much as an hour, with the decanter at his elbow and his cigar in his hand. The candles burned down. The smoke rose blue toward the ceiling. He read the evening paper. He thought perhaps of the day in court, of the brief he had in his bag, of the small ledger in his desk in which he entered every shilling, of the doctor at Sydenham, whose name was not to be spoken, of the wife in the next room, whose past had been larger than his patience. By 9:30 the household began to climb the stairs. The under-housemaid had by that hour made her last round of the bedrooms. She had snuffed the candles. She had drawn the curtains. She had turned down the bedclothes. She had filled the white china jug at the kitchen pump from the deep stone sink. She had carried the jug up the back stairs, and the second jug, and the third. She had set them upon the marble washstands of each bedroom, beside a clean glass tumbler. Charles's tumbler was a plain one, of heavy lead crystal, that had stood in his room since his wedding day. The jug was full. The glass was empty. The clock in the hall struck 10, then past. Then 11. The candles in the dining room were finally snuffed. The dishes were cleared down the back stairs. The doors were locked. The fires were banked. The household, one by one, climbed to their rooms. On most evenings this was the long quiet end of the day, and nothing of any note occurred between the snuffing of the candles and the ringing of the church bell at 5 the next morning. On most evenings. On the evening of the 18th of April 1876, it was not so. On that evening the white china jug stood already filled upon the marble washstand. The clean glass tumbler stood beside it. The bed was turned down. The candles burned soft. The corridor was empty, and somewhere in the long quiet rooms of the house a small brown bottle, or a small white packet, had been brought up from where it usually lay, and a measured dose of bitter metallic powder had been stirred, in silence, into the water of that jug. It had been done before Charles climbed the stairs. It had been done while the family was still at dinner, perhaps, or while the women were at tea. By whose hand it had been done, no living person ever afterwards confessed. The candles burned steady. The clock ticked. And upstairs, in a quiet bedroom papered in stripes of grey and cream, a glass of water waited on a marble stand for a man who was about to come up the stairs. Chapter 7. The last glass of water. Tuesday the 18th of April had not been a kind day to Charles Bravo. Even before its candles were lit, it had begun with rain. A thin grey drizzle had been falling since before dawn, soaking the gravel of the drive, blacking the bark of the chestnuts, smearing the windows of the morning room. Charles came down to breakfast in a sour temper. He had slept badly. His teeth had ached in the night, particularly a back tooth on the lower right side, and he had rubbed laudanum into his gum from a small dark bottle kept in the drawer of his washstand. The laudanum, an opium tincture of Dr. Squire of Oxford Street, had given him a thick head and a worse mouth. He drank his coffee black and very strong. He scarcely spoke to Florence. At 9, the brougham was brought round. He was due in chambers at the Inner Temple by 11. Florence, against her better judgment, had agreed to ride up with him as far as Victoria in order to do a little shopping in town. They climbed into the carriage in silence. The grey mare Cremorne pulled them down the drive at a walk, then a trot. The wheel splashed through small brown puddles in the lane. Within minutes, in the closed dim space of the brougham, the quarrel of every recent day flared into life again. The cause, as so often, was a small thing. Florence had said lightly that she would call upon a friend in Pimlico after her shopping. Charles, his head still thick with laudanum, had asked sharply who the friend was. Florence had answered. The name was a Mrs. Edwards, an old acquaintance, perfectly respectable. Charles had observed with a coldness that had become his speciality that he had not been informed of this Mrs. Edwards before, and that he found it very strange. Florence had begun to weep. Charles had tapped on the front of the brougham with his cane and called up to Griffiths to turn the carriage and drive home. Florence had at once cried out that she did not wish to go home, that she was being treated like a child. The argument lasted perhaps 3 minutes. By its end, Charles had agreed to continue into town. They drove on. They did not speak again until Victoria. He left her at the corner of Victoria Street. She did her shopping at the great draper's, ordered a length of pale grey ribbon to be sent down to the Priory, took luncheon alone at a quiet hotel near the station, and caught the 2 o'clock train back to Balham. She was, by the time she reached home, more weary than angry. She lay down on the sofa in the morning room, with a shawl over her knees, and slept until nearly 4. Charles, in his chambers, dealt with 2 small briefs and dictated a letter to his clerk. At 3 he left chambers and walked back to Victoria. Instead of taking the train at once, he went round to the stables of a friend who kept a small pony for him near the Bedford Hotel in Balham. The pony, a chestnut cob named Cremorne also, in a curious echo, had been fresh in the box for days, and Charles wished to ride. He rode out from the stable-yard at 4:30. He took the pony down the lane toward the common, intending a sharp gallop along the bridle path that ran beside Tooting Beck. 1/2 mile from the stables the pony bolted. What had startled it? Perhaps a dog from a hedge, perhaps the squeak of a market cart. No one ever discovered. The pony took the bit between its teeth and ran. Charles sawed at the reins. He could not stop it. They thundered along the lane for nearly 2 miles, past startled costermongers, past a ploughman who scrambled into a ditch, past a child who screamed at the gate of a cottage. The pony at last slowed of its own exhaustion in a meadow on the far side of the common. Charles, white-faced and shaking, slid out of the saddle and walked it home, his legs trembling, his hands clenched. By the time he reached the Bedford stables, it was past 6. He gave the pony to the groom with a curt word. He walked the 1/2 mile back to the Priory. He came up the drive in the soft April dusk, his trousers spattered with mud, his hat damp, his face the colour of cold tea. He did not go to the morning room. He went straight up the back stairs to his bedroom and rang for the under-housemaid. He told her to draw him a long hot bath at once. He stripped off his sodden clothes. He sank into the steaming water of the small bathroom across the corridor and lay there for nearly half an hour. The hot bath did him good. By 6:45 he had emerged, dressed in a fresh shirt and a black evening coat, brushed his hair, even hummed a short snatch of a tune. He came down to the dining room at 7:30 in time for the gong, and sat at the head of the table with a manner that was, for him, almost cheerful. The dinner that night had been ordered by Mrs. Cox in the morning before the quarrel in the brougham. It was a careful, comfortable, suburban dinner of the kind that Mrs. Hunt could prepare in her sleep. There was a clear soup made of beef stock and a little sherry, served from a silver tureen. There was a fish course of whiting, fried lightly in butter and breadcrumbs, with a quartered lemon. There was a roast of lamb, served with mint sauce, mashed potatoes, spring greens, and a dish of carrots glazed with butter and a little sugar. There was a savoury at the end, poached eggs on a bed of anchovy butter spread upon hot toast. The wines were, as they always were, a little sherry with the soup, a little hock with the fish. The Burgundy, decanted that afternoon by the parlour-maid from a fresh bottle, stood in its cut-glass decanter on the sideboard and was served only to Charles. Florence, who was still recovering from the loss of the second pregnancy and had been feeling delicate all week, drank a glass of sherry with her dinner and asked the parlour-maid for a glass of Marsala wine afterwards. Mrs. Cox drank water with a little wine in it, in the manner of those who do not care to be seen drinking. Charles had 2 glasses of the Burgundy, perhaps 3. He praised it to no one in particular. He was, by the end of the lamb, in a noticeably better humour than he had been all day. There was a little conversation. Charles spoke of the pony and his runaway ride, with a kind of wry self-mockery that was rare in him. Florence, gentler now after her sleep, listened and even laughed once. Mrs. Cox observed that he had been very fortunate not to be thrown. Charles agreed. The candles burned soft. The clock in the hall struck 9. Florence, who had been growing tired through the meal, rose from her chair before the savoury was cleared. She said she wished to go upstairs to lie down. Mrs. Cox rose with her. Charles, half rising in curtsy, sank back into his chair. The two women left the dining room and crossed the hall to the foot of the staircase. It is here that the smallest of all small details, written down years afterward in the careful evidence of a housemaid, must be set into its place. As Florence and Mrs. Cox climbed the stairs, the under-housemaid Mary Ann Keeber came down them, carrying a small silver tray with the bottle of Marsala for the lady of the house. She passed Charles in the hall. He had risen from the table, stretched, and stepped out for a moment to the foot of the stairs. He looked up at his wife's retreating figure. Then he turned to Mary Ann. He looked at her, said nothing, and looked at her again. He seemed, to her, paler than usual. He did not speak. He went back into the dining room and shut the door. At 9:15, Charles came out of the dining room and climbed the stairs. He passed the door of his wife's bedroom, where Florence was being helped out of her gown by Mary Ann. He paused. He pushed the door open. He stood in the doorway and accused her in a quick, angry French of having drunk wine all day. Florence, half undressed, did not answer. He stamped out, stamped down the corridor to his own room, and shut the door behind him. In his own bedroom the candles burned soft on the marble mantel. The fire in the grate had been banked. The bed was turned down, the white linen sheet folded back. On the marble washstand stood the white china jug, full. Beside it stood the clean glass tumbler. The dark bottle of laudanum stood on the lower shelf of his washstand, where he had left it at breakfast. The room was still warm from the bath he had taken before dinner. Charles, by his own habits, took out the bottle of laudanum first. His tooth was paining him again, the slow grinding ache of a deep cavity that he had been promising himself for weeks to have seen to. He poured a few drops onto a small linen pad, set the pad against his lower right gum, and held it there for a moment. He set the bottle back on the shelf. He turned to the marble washstand. He lifted the white china jug with a small blue band in his right hand. He poured water into the heavy lead crystal tumbler. He lifted the tumbler. He drank. The water was cool. It tasted of nothing in particular. He set the glass down. He began to undo his cravat. What entered his body in that single deep swallow was, as it was later determined by chemists and doctors of the Royal College, somewhere between 30 and 40 grains of tartar emetic, a derivative of antimony, dissolved in the water of the jug. 3 grains was a sufficient dose to make a healthy adult violently ill. 10 grains was the recognized lethal dose. The jug contained, by the calculation of a careful pharmacist, perhaps 10 times the amount required to kill a full-grown man. For perhaps 2 minutes after the swallow, Charles felt nothing. He removed his cravat. He unbuttoned his coat. He sat down on the edge of the bed to take off his boots. He bent to the right boot first, his fingers loosening the laces. The first wave came as he straightened up. It was a deep, rolling cramp in the stomach, sharp and surprising, as if a hand had reached into his belly and twisted. He gasped and bent forward. The second wave came almost at once, and with it the first rising tide of nausea. He stumbled to his feet. He took 2 steps toward the door. The third wave brought him to his knees. He retched onto the carpet. He retched again. The smell of the soup and the lamb and the burgundy rose up around him. He dragged himself to the door. He pulled it open with a hand that shook. He staggered out into the gaslit corridor, his cravat undone, his shirt damp at the collar, his face white as the wall behind him. He gripped the banister at the top of the stairs. He raised his voice, hoarse and ragged, into the silence of the seeping house. "Florence, Florence," he called. "Hot water. Hot water, for God's sake." Below in the hall, the long case clock ticked through its slow seconds. The candle on the half landing flickered. Skirts began to rustle in the corridor. Doors opened. Mary Ann Keeber, half undressed for bed in her room under the eaves, threw her shawl about her shoulders, and came running down the back stairs. The under-housemaid called out for Mrs. Cox. Mrs. Cox, in her dark gown, with her small lace cap still pinned upon her hair, came swiftly along the corridor from her own room. the candle in her hand throwing a long, thin shadow up the wall. She reached him first. She reached him before Florence, who was in her own bedroom only feet away. She reached him before Marianne, who had to come down 2 flights. She reached him, in those first seconds, before any other living soul. What words passed between them in that first minute? No living person ever afterwards reported with any consistency. Mrs. Cox said, in her later evidence, that Charles murmured to her, "I have taken poison for Dr. Gully. Do not tell Florence." She said this in a low voice, drawn out only after careful questioning. Days later, when the household was already cracked open by inquiry, she said it with her eyes upon her embroidery. She would, in the months that followed, change small parts of her story more than once. What is certain is this. By the time Marianne reached the head of the stairs, Charles had collapsed against the banister and was vomiting into a basin she had snatched up from the washstand of an empty bedroom. By the time Florence emerged from her own room in her dressing gown, the corridor smelt of bile and burgundy. By the time the first messenger had been sent on the run down the lane to fetch a doctor, Charles Bravo's face had taken on the dull leaden colour that the physicians of that age knew, with a particular dread as the look of antimony. The candles in the corridor burned soft. The clock below struck the half-hour after 10. The white china jug stood quiet on the marble washstand of his bedroom, half emptied. Beside it lay the heavy lead crystal tumbler. Empty now, the last few drops trembling at its bottom. He had 3 days to live. Chapter 8. 3 Days of Candles. The first doctor to reach the Priory that night was a young man named Harrison of Streatham, who came down the lane in a pony trap with his bag still half open beside him on the seat. He had been roused from his fireside by the messenger sent by Mrs. Cox, a stable boy who had run, hatless, with a scrawled note pressed in his fist. The boy had banged on the doctor's door at 20 minutes to 11. The doctor was at the bedside by 11. He came up the gravel drive in the dark. The iron gate stood open. The chestnut trees rose like black towers against a moonless sky. The front door was already opened by the parlour-maid, her cap askew, her hands trembling. She did not speak. She only pointed up the staircase. Dr. Harrison took the stairs 2 at a time, his bag bumping against his knee. In the corridor above, he found the household in a kind of quiet panic. Marianne Keeber knelt beside the bed with a basin and a towel. Mrs. Cox stood at the bedside in her dark gown, her face composed but very pale, a candle in her hand. Florence, in her dressing gown, sat on the edge of the bed and held her husband's hand. Charles himself lay propped against the pillows, his shirt open at the throat, his face the colour of old paper. He was retching steadily into the basin. He could not speak above a whisper. The doctor felt his pulse. He listened to his breathing. He looked into his eyes. He asked, in the gentle bedside voice of his profession, what the gentleman had eaten that evening, what he had drunk, what he had taken for his teeth. Charles managed a few answers. The dinner, the burgundy, the laudanum, a glass of water from the jug. The doctor listened, and he looked at the white china jug standing quiet on the marble washstand, and he knew, with the chill that came to all young doctors in that century when they saw what he was now seeing, that he was looking at a case of poisoning. He could not tell that night what the poison was. The retching might have been opium. The colour might have been arsenic. The cramps might have been a dozen things. But he knew that the dose, whatever it was, had been a heavy one. He gave Charles an emetic of mustard and warm water. He gave him, when that did not work quickly enough, a more violent emetic of zinc sulphate. He held a basin while the young barrister was sick again and again. He sent at once for a second opinion, a senior physician of Wimpole Street named Dr. Moore, who arrived shortly after midnight in a hansom cab. By 2 in the morning a third doctor had come, and Mr. Royce Bell, a personal friend of the Bravo family, brought down from town by Charles's stepfather, who himself had been telegraphed in the small hours, and who was, even then, on his way from Palace Green in Kensington. By 5, when the first grey light was beginning at the edges of the curtains, a fourth doctor stood at the bedside. By morning of the 19th, there were 5. The greatest of them, the one whose arrival was watched for like the coming of a king, was Sir William Whitty Gull. He was the royal physician. He had been called in to attend the heir to the throne 5 years before, when the young Prince of Wales had nearly died of the typhoid fever that had killed his father. Sir William was a heavy, calm man of 60, with deep-set eyes and a voice like a bishop's. He came up the gravel drive of the Priory shortly before noon in a black brougham with the royal arms on the panel. The household stood aside as he climbed the stairs. He sat down by the bedside. He took Charles's wrist. He looked into his eyes for a long, long minute. He asked in his slow, clear voice what the patient had taken. Charles by this time was weaker, his lips dry, the leaden colour deepening under his eyes. He answered only that he had taken a little laudanum for his tooth and had drunk a glass of water from his jug. Sir William asked him very gently whether he had taken anything else. Charles looked at him. He turned his face toward the wall. He said only, "I have told you all I know." It was an answer he was to give again and again, to every doctor who bent over his pillow in the days that followed, to his weeping mother when she arrived from Kensington, to his stepfather, to the policeman who came up from the local station with his notebook in his hand. "I have told you all I know." He gave no name. He pointed no finger. He blamed no one in the house. He did not even, in the long hours of that first morning, ask what the substance might have been that was now eating its way through his body. He lay quiet. He retched. He drank a little iced water when it was offered. He gripped Florence's hand from time to time. He did not curse his wife. He did not curse Mrs. Cox. He did not curse the doctor at Sydenham, whom he had so often cursed in life. He lay, and he waited. The doctors meanwhile worked over him with the limited weapons of their century. They administered emetics. They administered a clyster of warm water and starch. They gave him small sips of brandy. They tried, as the morning wore on, a stomach pump, a brass and rubber instrument that had to be fed down the throat. Charles bore it without crying out. They washed out the stomach with warm water. They examined what came up. They sent it away in covered glass jars to be tested by chemists in town. By the early afternoon of the 19th, the chemists had given their first answer. The substance was antimony, in the form of tartar emetic. The dose had been very large. The doctors at the bedside, on hearing this, looked at one another and knew. In a healthy adult of 30, a dose of tartar emetic of the size suggested by the chemist's figures, taken in a single swallow, was not likely to be survived. It had only been the violence of his early vomiting and the strength of his constitution that had given him even the chance of these few days. Charles was told. He nodded. He did not exclaim. He did not weep. He asked his stepfather in the quietest voice whether his small daughter Katie, who was then being raised in a small establishment in the country, would be cared for. The stepfather promised that she would be. Charles closed his eyes. The Priory, in those 3 days, became a strange and terrible little kingdom. The drive was full of carriages. The hall was thick with the smell of medicines, of camphor, of warm bread poultices, of the faint sweet ether the doctors used in small cloths against his temples. The candles were lit in the bedroom day and night, 2 on the marble mantel, 2 on the small table at the bedside. The white china jug, the one that had stood upon the washstand on the evening of the 18th, had been removed by Dr. Moore on the morning of the 19th and placed under seal in a cupboard downstairs to be examined by police. A second jug had taken its place. Nobody, in the days that followed, drank from it without thinking. Outside the bedroom door, in the corridor, the household kept its long, uneasy vigil. The cook, Mrs. Hunt, sent up small basins of beef tea every 2 hours, untouched, taken away again. Mary Ann Keeber sat on a small stool at the end of the corridor, her apron crumpled in her hands, and watched the doctors come and go. Mrs. Cox went in and out of the sick room with a steadiness that one of the doctors, in his private notes, described as remarkable. Florence sat by her husband's bed mostly, holding his hand. Sometimes she rose and walked to the window and looked out over the garden where the chestnut trees were now in full pale bloom. Sometimes she went down to the dining room and drank a small glass of sherry to steady herself. She slept, when she slept, on a small couch drawn up to the bedside. On the second day, the 20th of April, Charles dictated his will. He sent down for a sheet of legal paper. He propped himself a little against the pillows. He asked for his stepfather, for his mother, and for Mr. Brooks, an old friend of the family. The will was short. He left everything he possessed, which was not very much in his own name, to his wife Florence. He asked her in a separate verbal request to be kind to his daughter Katie and to see that she was educated. He signed the paper with a hand that shook. He fell back upon the pillows. His stepfather, sitting beside him, asked him then, very quietly, what had happened on the night of the 18th. Charles turned his head on the pillow. He looked at his stepfather for a long moment. He said, "I have taken laudanum for my tooth. That is all I have taken that I know of." The stepfather pressed him. "Surely," he said, "you must have taken something else." Charles closed his eyes. He said again, "I have told you all I know." Mrs. Cox, in those second-day hours, drew aside one of the older doctors in the corridor and told him a different story. She said that Charles, on the first night, in those few minutes when she had reached him alone in the corridor, had whispered to her, "I have taken poison for Dr. Gully. Do not tell Florence." She said it in her quiet, level voice, with her eyes upon the carpet. The doctor wrote it down in his notebook. He took her into the sick room and made her repeat it. Charles, hearing her, did not contradict her. He did not confirm her. He turned his face once again to the wall and said only, "I have told you all I know." By the evening of the 20th, the leaden colour of his face had become a faint blue about the lips. His pulse was thready. His skin was cold to the touch. He could no longer keep down even a sip of water. The doctors, in a low conference on the landing, agreed that there was nothing more they could do. Sir William Gull, who had returned for a second visit late in the afternoon, came out of the bedroom shaking his great grey head. He said, in his measured voice, to Charles's stepfather, "He has not behaved like a man who thinks he has been murdered. He has behaved like a man who has done a thing to himself and has not the courage to undo it." The stepfather, holding his hat in his hand, said only, "Sir William, my son was not a man to take his own life." Sir William looked at the floor. He said, "We see what we see." The night of the 20th was a long one. The candles burned in the sick room from dusk till dawn, snuffed and renewed by Mary Ann at every change of watch. Florence sat at the bedside with her husband's hand in hers. Mrs. Cox sat in a chair against the wall. The stepfather was below, in the dining room, with a glass of brandy he did not drink. The doctors came in one by one and held the wrist, and looked at the eyes and went out again. The clock in the hall struck 12. It struck 1. It struck 2. At about 3 in the morning, Charles spoke for the last time with any clarity. He opened his eyes. He looked at Florence. He said very softly, "Be kind." He closed his eyes. After that he spoke only in broken sounds, half words, the names of streets he had walked, the name of his daughter once, very faint. He grew colder. His breathing slowed. At 20 minutes past 5 on the morning of Friday the 21st of April 1876, with the first grey light coming into the bedroom, and the chestnut trees in the drive standing dim and pale beyond the curtain, Charles Bravo died. The doctor who closed his eyes was Mr. Roy's Bell. He laid the young man's hand upon the coverlet. He stood up. He looked at the women in the room. He said, "He is gone." For perhaps a minute, no one moved. The candles burned soft. The clock in the hall far below struck the half-hour. Outside, somewhere over the common, a single early bird began to sing. Florence put her face in her hands. Mrs. Cox sat very still in her chair against the wall, her eyes lowered, her mouth a thin, straight line. 3 days. From the swallow on Tuesday night to the silence of Friday dawn. 3 days of candles, of basins, of doctors on the stairs, of carriages in the drive. 3 days of a young man with 3 days to live. The body was washed by Mary Ann and the under-housemaid in the slow, careful way of those years. He was laid in his nightshirt upon the bed with a single white sheet drawn to his chin. The blinds of the house were lowered. Black crape was tied to the brass knocker. By 8 o'clock the news had begun to travel down the lane. By 10 it had reached Fleet Street. Within a week it would be known by every breakfast table in England. On the first Saturday after the death, Charles Bravo was buried at West Norwood Cemetery, on a green hillside south of the Thames, beneath a quiet headstone of pale grey granite. A black-plumed hearse drew his coffin up the steep cemetery road. His stepfather walked behind. His mother walked behind in deepest mourning. Florence did not attend. She had been advised by the doctors not to leave her bed. Mrs. Cox sat in the morning room of the Priory in her dark gown and answered very quietly the door. The candles in the bedroom had been put out. The window had been opened to the spring air. The white china jug, still sealed in its cupboard below stairs, waited for the police. Chapter 9. The Inquest Chamber. The newspapers came first. By the morning after the burial, every London paper had carried at least a paragraph upon the strange death of the young barrister of Bedford Hill. Within a week, the paragraphs had become columns. Within a fortnight, the columns had become full pages. The Times, that grey and stately register of the Empire's affairs, gave a careful, dry account. The Daily Telegraph, livelier and louder, asked open questions. The Illustrated London News printed, in its great folded sheets, an engraving of the Priory itself, with its turrets and its Gothic windows and the gravel drive between the chestnut trees, beneath the heading, "The Mysterious Death at Balham." The Illustrated Police News. A coarser paper sold for a penny on street corners, printed an engraving of Charles in his bed, of Florence at his side in her dressing gown, of Mrs. Cox standing in the doorway with her candle. The drawings were not from life. The artists had never set foot in the house. They drew what their readers wished to see. The first inquest had already been opened, in a hurried and nearly secret manner, on the 25th of April, 4 days after the death, in the morning room of the Priory itself. It was held by the coroner for East Surrey, a Mr. William Carter. The jury was composed of local tradesmen, a butcher from Balham High Road, a stationer, a builder, a small farmer from Tooting. They sat in the morning room on chairs brought in from the dining room. Refreshments of cold ham and porter were provided by the household, in the manner of inquests of that century. Florence was not called. The medical evidence was given. The chemist's analysis of the contents of the stomach, which by that morning had identified the antimony beyond question, was read aloud. The coroner, more concerned, in his own private words to a colleague, to spare the feelings of a respectable family than to expose the truth, directed the jury toward an open verdict. The jury duly returned one. There was, they declared, not sufficient evidence under what circumstances the antimony had entered the deceased's body. The case was closed. It would not stay closed. On the morning of the 26th, the Daily Telegraph printed a leading article that read like a slap to the face of Mr. Carter. The inquest, it said, had been conducted in a secret and unsatisfactory manner. A young man of 30 had died in agony. A great quantity of poison had been administered. A respectable young woman of fortune and her female companion had been the only adults in the house at the time, and a coroner, sitting in the very rooms in which the death had occurred, had returned a verdict that named nothing, accused nothing, and explained nothing. The article ended with a question. Was this how the death of an English gentleman was to be settled in a private morning room over a cold luncheon, by the goodwill of those who lived in the house? The article did its work. By the end of April, the case had become the great spectacle of the spring. The Bravo family, themselves outraged at the manner of the first inquest, hired a London solicitor of reputation, a Mr. George Lewis, who would in years to come become the most feared discreet lawyer in England. They petitioned the Home Secretary. They demanded a fresh inquiry. The Metropolitan Police, who had not been called upon at all in the first days, were now formally engaged. A senior detective, Detective Chief Inspector George Clark of Scotland Yard, was sent down to Balham. Inspector Clark was a man of about 50, stocky, plain-spoken, with a careful manner and a long memory. He came to the Priory on the 8th of May. Florence, by this time, had left the house and was staying at her hotel in Brighton, accompanied by Mrs. Cox and her elderly mother, in part to recover from her illness, in part to escape the reporters who now stood in groups along the lane outside the iron gates. With her written consent, the inspector and his men entered the house. They searched it from the cellars to the attic. They opened every drawer, every cupboard, every wardrobe. They lifted the carpets. They shook out the curtains. They went down to the stable yard and examined the saddle room, where the brown bottle of tartar emetic kept by Griffiths was no longer to be found. The coachman by this time had quietly left the household, having been dismissed some weeks before the death after a quarrel with Charles over a careless piece of driving. He told the inspector, when later questioned, that he had thrown the bottle on the rubbish heap before he left. No one had seen him do it. No one could prove that he had not. The inspector recovered in his search only 2 substances of medical interest. He took from the small bottle on Charles's washstand a laudanum of Dr. Squire of Oxford Street. He took from the same shelf a small bottle of chloroform. He took from the kitchen a small package of Gregory's powder, a common Victorian remedy. He found no antimony anywhere in the house. He found no white packet, no brown bottle, no trace of the substance that by every chemical certainty had been stirred into the white china jug on the night of the 18th. Whoever had used it had, at some time in the days that followed, removed the evidence. The inspector took 13 empty wine bottles from the dining room sideboard and the cellar, the bottles that had stood upon the table on the night of the dinner. He found nothing in them. He took the white china jug from its cupboard. where it had been sealed by the doctors, and sent it to a chemist. The chemist found nothing. By the time the jug had reached his table, it had been washed. Inspector Clark spent 4 weeks in interviews. He sat in the morning room of the Priory and questioned Marianne Keeber, who answered him with tears running down her cheeks. He questioned the cook, Mrs. Hunt, who answered him in a Devon accent so soft he had to lean forward to catch her words. He questioned the parlour-maid. He questioned the under-housemaid. He questioned Griffiths, the coachman in a public house in Herne Bay, whither the man had retreated. He took the train to Brighton, and questioned Florence and Mrs. Cox in a private parlour of their hotel, with the sea fog blowing in through the open window. He travelled to Sydenham and questioned Dr. Gully, who received him in a small dim study with a bookcase of medical works behind him, and who answered every question in a calm and weary voice. He returned to the yard. He wrote a long report. He concluded at the end of it that nothing had been elicited to show by what means the deceased had met his death. That, however, was not the end of the matter. The Home Secretary, pressed by the Bravo family and by the press, had already ordered a second inquest. It opened on the 11th of July in the Assembly Room of the Bedford Hotel in Balham, only a quarter of a mile down the road from the Priory itself. The Bedford Hotel was a long, low public house with a coaching yard behind. Its assembly room at the back had been used in earlier years for Masonic dinners and smoking concerts. Now, for 23 days that summer, it became the most watched single room in England. A long table was set up across one end. Behind it sat the coroner, the same Mr. Carter, this time chastened and grim. Beside him a clerk with a great inkstand, and on either side, on long benches, the jurymen, 20 in number now, drawn from the householders of Balham. Before them, in 2 facing rows, sat the lawyers. Mr. John Holker, the Attorney-General himself, attended for the Crown. Mr. George Lewis appeared for the Bravo family. Sir Henry James, soon to be Attorney-General in his turn, appeared for Florence. Other counsel appeared for Dr. Gully, for Mrs. Cox, for the Bravo stepfather. Behind them sat the witnesses, more than 50 in all, in a long, uneasy line. Behind the witnesses sat the press, in a tight pen at the back, perhaps 30 reporters from every paper in the kingdom, scribbling shorthand in small leather books. The doors stood open. The crowds outside the Bedford Hotel reached, in those summer mornings, almost to the high road. For 23 days the testimony rolled out. Marianne Keeber wept in the witness box. Mrs. Hunt, the cook, recited what she had cooked for dinner on the 18th, course by course, including the savoury of poached eggs upon anchovy butter. Griffiths, the coachman, called from Herne Bay, defended himself with grim determination. The doctors gave their evidence. Sir William Gull, in his slow magisterial voice, told the inquest that in his opinion Charles Bravo had not behaved like a man who knew himself to be murdered. Dr. Moore disagreed. Dr. Harrison deferred to his elders. But the great drama of the inquest was not the medical evidence. It was the testimony of Mrs. Cox and Florence, and the evidence about Dr. Gully, and the slow, terrible exposure of a young woman's private life to the breakfast tables of England. Mrs. Cox went first. She gave her account of the night of the 18th. She told the inquest that Charles had said to her, on the landing, "I have taken poison for Dr. Gully. Do not tell Florence." The room hung upon her words. The next day 100 newspapers carried the sentence in their largest type. By the afternoon, every clerk in the City of London was asking his neighbour what poison for Dr. Gully might mean. Florence went next. She wore black. Her face, beneath her crape veil, was very thin. She was 20 years old in poise and 100 in tiredness. Under questioning, with great gentleness from her own counsel, and great precision from the lawyers for the Bravo family, the story of her Malvern years emerged. The water cure. The kindly doctor of 62. The walks upon the hills. The journeys on the continent. The break in 1874. There was, of course, no question put openly about the worst of it. The lost child in the spa town in Bavaria. The decencies of the inquest forbade it. But the careful, oblique phrases of the lawyers, the long pauses, the lowered eyes, made clear to every reader of every paper in the kingdom that there had been a great deal more between the doctor and the young widow than walks upon the Malvern Hills. Dr. Gully himself appeared on the 14th day. He was a tall, stooped figure in a black frock coat, his beard a clean white, his eyes very tired. He spoke only when spoken to, and gave his answers without rancour and without evasion. Yes, there had been an attachment. Yes, it had been improper. Yes, it had ended in 1874. No, he had not seen Mrs. Bravo since. No, he had not been at the Priory on the night of the 18th of April. He had been, that evening, in his small house at Sydenham with his sister, where he could be vouched for by the parlour-maid and by a clergyman who had taken tea with him at 5. When he stepped down from the witness box, his career, his good name, his life's work were already in ruins. The papers that night carried him on every front page. Within a year he had ceased even his small private practice. He retired into his house at Sydenham and was rarely seen out of it again. He died an old man in 1883, his name forever yoked in the imagination of his country to a poisoning he had not committed. On the 11th of August, after 23 days of evidence, the jury at the Bedford Hotel withdrew. They returned in 2 hours. Their verdict, read out by their foreman in a hot, crowded room, was as follows. They were of the unanimous opinion that Charles Bravo had not died from natural causes, nor from his own hand by accident, nor from his own hand by intention. They were of the unanimous opinion that he had been wilfully murdered by the administration of tartar emetic. They were unable, however, on the evidence laid before them, to say by what hand or hands the deed had been done. Wilful murder. Person or persons unknown. It was the verdict of every reader who had followed the case. It was the verdict that no court of England could turn into a hanging. There was no defendant. There was no charge. There was no trial. The inquest rose. The crowds dispersed slowly along Bedford Hill. The reporters folded their notebooks. The lawyers gathered their papers. The Bedford Hotel closed its doors upon a long, hot, scandalous summer. The household of the Priory had already been broken. Marianne had given her notice. The cook had given hers. Griffiths was gone. The under-housemaid was gone. Only Mrs. Cox remained for a little time. Then she too, on the quiet advice of her solicitor, removed herself to a small house in Notting Hill with her 3 boys and faded, with surprising completeness, from the public eye. Florence Bravo did not return to live at the Priory. She closed up the house, paid off the remaining staff, and removed herself first to the seaside town of Southsea, then to a small house at Buscott Park among her family, where she was received with reluctance, then to a quieter villa near the sea at Southsea once more. She drank. She had drunk a little wine for years, in the way of widowed women of fortune, but now she drank steadily. She no longer rode. She no longer received. She sat in a small upstairs room with a glass of sherry in her hand and looked at the sea. She was 33 years old when she died, at Southsea, on the 17th of September, 1878, of, in the words of the medical certificate, the failure of the heart consequent upon habitual intemperance. She had outlived her husband by 2 years and 5 months. She was buried, as she had asked to be, under the name Mrs. Florence Turner, in a small Hampshire churchyard, with no inscription save her dates. The case of her husband's poisoning was never reopened. The papers of the inquest were gathered into bound volumes and placed in the records of the Home Office. The white china jug, the heavy lead crystal tumbler, the small dark laudanum bottle, all the small mute objects of a Tuesday evening in April, were dispersed and lost. The verdict of wilful murder by person or persons unknown stands to this day. The names debated in the years that followed are 4. Florence, who feared the cruelty of her marriage and who knew her husband was beating her. Mrs. Cox, who knew her position would be lost the moment Charles dismissed her. Dr. Gully, who had loved Florence and seen his life ruined. Charles himself, whose habit of tooth pain and laudanum and self-pity gave colour to a final, despairing theory. Each has had her or his defenders. Each has been argued and re-argued in the books that the long Victorian afternoon and the longer century after produced. None has ever been proved. None is ever now likely to be. The candles in the morning room had long since been snuffed. The white china jug had long since been broken or thrown away. The summer of 1876 closed. The autumn came on. The chestnut trees at the head of the drive shed their first brown fruit upon the gravel, and a new tenant prepared to take the lease. The Priory on Bedford Hill returned to silence. Chapter 10. The stones that remained time, in the way of those quiet southern suburbs of London, did with the Priory what it does to almost every house. It went on with it. The next tenant, a respectable gentleman of business, took the house at a reduced rent in 1877 and lived there in quiet privacy for some years. He was followed by another and another. The drive was raked. The chestnuts were trimmed. The lawns were mown. The marble of the hall was polished. The long-case clock in its dark mahogany case was wound each morning by some new housemaid in some new apron. The house outlived its first scandal, as houses do, and slipped slowly back into the long suburban sleep from which it had been so briefly woken. The Bedford Hotel down the road, where the long inquest had sat through the heat of that summer, remained a public house and remained one for many years. The assembly room behind it was used again for Masonic dinners, for political meetings, for wedding breakfasts. The voices that had spoken there about jugs of water and white packets of poison faded into the wallpaper. New voices replaced them. The last of the principal figures of the case lived only a little longer than the case itself. Dr. Gully died in 1883, at the age of 75, in his small house at Sydenham. Mrs. Cox lived on in obscurity in Notting Hill for many years, never speaking publicly of the case, raising her 3 sons into manhood. The bravo stepfather Joseph died in the 1880s. The cook, the maid, the coachman, the under-gardener, the under-housemaid, all of them moved on into other households or other lives, married or did not marry, were buried in time in cemeteries scattered across southern England, their part in the great mystery growing fainter in their memories with every passing year. The neighbourhood around the Priory changed with the city. In the years after the death of Charles Bravo, 2 brothers named Alfred and George Hiver bought up much of the surrounding land and laid out on the slopes of Bedford Hill 6 new streets of generously proportioned red brick houses, well built, double-fronted, with bay windows and small front gardens. They were the houses of clerks and managers and senior shopmen, of the new middle classes whom the railways were drawing southward out of central London. The fields where Charles had ridden his runaway pony became gardens. The lane along which the carriage had rolled to the train became a paved street with curbstones and lampposts. The market gardens shrank and disappeared. In the new century, 2 world wars passed over Balham, as they passed over all of London. In the second of them, in October of 1940, a bomb fell upon Balham High Road, close to the underground station, a quarter of a mile from Bedford Hill, and killed 66 people sheltering in the tunnels beneath. The Priory itself stood through it all. Its turrets shook in the bombing nights, but its walls held. Its windows were boarded, then reglazed, then painted, then reglazed again. In the year 1970, by the recommendation of the Royal Commission on the Historical Monuments of England, the Priory at 225 Bedford Hill, Balham, was placed upon the statutory list of buildings of special architectural and historic interest. It became, in the language of that protection, a Grade II listed building. Its turrets, its quatrefoil parapet, its pointed windows, its Gothic porch were all officially marked as a piece of the country's architectural memory. A small painted sign was fixed near the gate. Children walking home from school stopped sometimes to read it. In the year 1981, with the great single private houses of the Victorian suburbs no longer affordable to single private families, the building was acquired and converted into separate flats. The work was completed in the year following, in 1982. The hall of black and white marble was kept in its old proportions, but a new staircase was built within its old shell. The bedroom in which Charles Bravo died, the long quiet room papered once in stripes of grey and cream, became a part of a new apartment. The morning room where Mrs. Cox had stitched her ivy leaves became another. The dining room where the Burgundy had stood in its decanter became a sitting room belonging to other people. New houses were built upon a portion of the rear garden, in a small private close, neat and unremarkable. The chestnut trees at the head of the drive were felled in part, kept in part, replanted with younger trees. The iron gates remained. The Priory stands today as it stood in 1876 and as it stood in 1940 upon its hill above Tooting Beck Common. To approach it now, in the present age, the visitor turns south off Balham High Road and walks up Bedford Hill past the rows of red brick villas. The lane climbs gently. On a bright spring morning, one may still hear birds in the branches and the distant hum of the South Circular Road. Near the crown of the hill, on the eastern side, behind a low brick wall and an iron railing, the cream stucco of the Gothic villa rises into view, with its 4 slender turrets pointed against the sky. The pinnacles are still there. The narrow windows are still there. The pale stone porch is still there, though the brass mastiff knocker is long since gone, and the door is locked now to entry phones and visitor codes. If the visitor stands at the gates and looks up the gravel drive, the house is much as it was. The lawn is smaller, divided. The chestnut trees are younger but in their old places. The drive curves up between them as it always did. The light falls on the cream stucco and the grey lead pinnacles in the same way it has fallen for 210 springs and more. Few of the people who live in the house's separate flats know, when they cross its threshold each morning, what passed within its walls upon a single Tuesday evening in April of 1876. Some know. Some have read the books. They live there nonetheless. The kettle goes on. The post is collected. The day begins. The Bedford Hotel still stands at 77 Bedford Hill, a public house in the old style, much rebuilt and repainted, popular now for its music nights and its dining room. There is no plaque upon its wall to mark the inquest of 1876. There would be no room for it among the more recent histories of the building. West Norwood Cemetery, a few miles south, is now a great open green space among the inner suburbs of South London, kept by a charitable trust, beloved of dog walkers and historians and watchers of birds. The grave of Charles Bravo lies upon a quiet slope, beneath a simple headstone of pale grey granite. The stone is stained now with the soft black of London's long centuries of soot. The lettering, once sharp, is faint. The grave is rarely visited. In a small Hampshire chard, far to the south of the city, beneath a different sky and beside a different sea, a stone marks the grave of a Mrs. Florence Turner, who died in 1878 at the age of 33. The stone gives her dates only. It does not give her birth name. Few of the visitors who pass through that churchyard now know who she was. The grass grows over. In a quiet corner of the cemetery at Sydenham, the bones of an old physician with a long white beard rest beneath a stone that mentions only his medical degree and his many years of practice. There is nothing upon the stone of Malvern. There is nothing of Bedford Hill. These, then, are the dead of the Priory in 1876. Charles Deloney Turner Bravo, barrister of the Inner Temple, born in St Pancras in November of 1845, died in the small bedroom on the first floor of the Gothic villa on Bedford Hill in the small hours of the 21st of April 1876 at the age of 30. He had a young daughter named Katie whom he asked at the very end his family to be kind to. She lived. She grew up. Florence Campbell Bravo, born at Sydney in the colony of New South Wales in September of 1845, who became Mrs. Ricardo at the age of 19 and Mrs. Bravo at the age of 30, died at Southsea on the 17th of September 1878 at the age of 33. She was buried under the name Mrs. Florence Turner in a small Hampshire churchyard with no further inscription. James Manby Gully, physician of Malvern, born in Jamaica in March of 1808, died at Sydenham on the 27th of March 1883 at the age of 75. Jane Cannon Cox, the small, dark-eyed widow who sat in the morning room with her embroidery and stood in the corridor with her candle, who was the only living person ever to claim that Charles Bravo had named the substance that killed him, lived on quietly with her 3 sons, and died in her own time, in old age, far from any candle. Alexander Louis Ricardo, Florence's first young husband, born of a famous family of bankers, dead in Cologne in April of 1871 of the long destruction of his own drinking, at the age of 28, lies in a German cemetery whose stones have been reset more than once. These are the names that the documented record of the case allows the historian to speak. They lived before they were lost. They walked the lanes and the corridors of a small green corner of Victorian London. They sat at the same dining table on the night of the 18th of April. They climbed the same staircase. One of them, by some hand never named, drank from a glass of water that was not water alone. The candle and marble mantel of the bedroom has long been snuffed. The white china jug has long been broken. The small brown bottle on the high shelf in the saddle room has long been thrown away. The chestnut trees in the drive have been replanted twice. The fog of the year 1876 has lifted from the Thames. The empire that the fog covered is gone. But the house upon the hill is still there. The lane still climbs from the high road. The common still lies dark and quiet beyond. And upon a marble washstand in a memory of a bedroom that no longer exists, upon a single Tuesday evening in April that will never come again, a glass of water still waits for a young man who is climbing the stairs. The candle has burned low. The chamber has fallen silent, and history once again has turned the page in the dark. Sleep gently, wherever you are listening from, until the next quiet hour when the lamp is turned low and the centuries are read aloud once more.